My name's Carson, Suarage, and my thesis is on virtual communities and analyzing the benefits, opportunities, and threats that it has on the modern identity. So in light of global communities, like Michelle just mentioned, I'm going to tell you a lot today about our virtual world that we all live in, and I'm hoping to expand your perspective on everything that's happening because, believe it or not, we're struggling to keep up. So firstly, hey there, Generation Z. I'm talking to most of the people in this room, excluding adults and teachers, and what this means is we were born between 1995 and 2010. So I'm part of this generation, so researching about it got kind of odd, but in literature, they would mention us as digital natives, which essentially means that we grew up with technology being a very prevalent and accessible source, and because this was when we were forming our identities and our interactions and our social circle, it affects who we are and how we communicate with one another. And we haven't been able to see the long-term effects of this yet, but we soon will. But soon enough, in 5 years actually, we will make up 10% of the workforce, and the workforce is freaking out because we are so different. We are a very unique generation. So much has happened between 1995 and 2010, and the way that we are reached by advertisements or communicated with and sharing messages with is very different. And it's creating a generational tension that I will discuss later. But in closing, we're very different. We're digital natives. I'm going to call us that. And because we're digital natives, we use virtual communities. And these are things like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Tumblr, Twitter, all the things we have popping up on our phones all the time. And these communities I began to research from a sociological standpoint when I was researching for my thesis. And so I began to build them up by this simple formula. The things that make up knowledge exchanging, which is the most essential part of a community, are familiarity, trust, and reciprocation. And what this means is you're entering a community with some purpose. You're wanting something out of it, and you identify somehow with the members in it. You trust them with your information that you're sharing. You trust them to reciprocate it or give you what you give into it. So whether this be sharing photos on Facebook or Instagram, you're expecting to see photos of your followers or friends or family and just receive the information that you're putting out there. And so knowledge exchanging is a very simple concept because it's the most conceptual and fundamental part of communication. And when we form relationships with people, this knowledge exchanging becomes increasingly intimate, and this becomes what we call self-disclosure. And so self-disclosure is oftentimes demonstrated by the onion model. So if you think of the onion model and us being at the core of it, when you get to know a person and the trust increases and the relationship builds, the information that you share with the person becomes increasingly intimate. And you can think of this in a fun way like the Shrek model where ogres are onions at the core. But this is a very natural thing and a very positive thing, and it's a very psychologically beneficial thing. It heightens our self-esteem. The more we learn about others leads to the more we know about ourselves. And it has very just positive effects all around because we are a societal species. We are prone to forming these relationships and self-disclosing in regular communities. However, online in our virtual communities, the virtual part becomes more prevalent when we see anonymity come into play. So anonymity is anytime you're on Google Chrome and you go in incognito mode, but essentially you're not very evidently yourself. Your profile and your identity is not what you're advertising when you're talking to people. And this aspect seems minor at first. It actually helps self-disclosure happen because we become more impulsive and more trusting in others. But this does, as you could imagine, have negative benefits. So phenomena have begun to form as we've been maturing and our generation's been developing. And a few of these include cyberbullying, catfishing, and trolling. And I assume you've heard about a lot of these before, but to break them down, cyberbullying is bullying online, and this becomes very easy because people don't usually have to receive responsibilities for their actions because anonymity kind of puts a shield behind the words they say. And catfishing is whenever people have fake profiles and essentially steal someone's identity and form a relationship, a very intimate one, with another person. And there's a show about it, and it's very interesting and comical at times because it is so new and it seems fantastical at times, but it's actually a very common thing. And then lastly, trolling, which is just going online and spreading information that may defamate or put down the reputation of somebody else. And the information can be false. I know you've heard of fake news because that's a very big thing right now, but we can't regulate this or monitor it, and it's a very real-time thing that's happening every day to a lot of people. And anonymity kind of catalyzes these dilemmas to become a big deal. So to expand more on anonymity, I'm going to mention the term de-individuation. And de-individuation is essentially the mindset that we get put into when we are in an anonymous environment, like when we are online on these virtual communities. So to think of de-individuation in simple terms, if you've ever heard of the Stanford prison experiment, to sum it up, a lot of people who are morally in tune were given roles as either a prison inmate or an official of it and a warrant. And these morally in tune people became abusers very fast, and they became very malicious. They began doing very socially deviant things all the time, and it got to a point where the experiment essentially had to be shut down. And so this is an extreme instance, but it shows how dangerous the de-individuated mindset can be to people, especially when we're on these virtual communities. And so with all of these things, new threats, dilemmas, and ethical controversies come up, and we have to learn how to approach them. And a few that I'm going to mention that are very prevalent and essential are our reputations being at risk. So if you think about a post that you put on Twitter or Facebook, it's something that you can go back and delete later, or a photo that you would put on Instagram. And because we can take down these posts and they aren't in our history or on our timeline, they aren't really gone. To make this more understandable, on Snapchat, you have your stories and they expire in 24 hours, but anyone can take a screenshot of this story. They can share it with their friends. They can put it out through a lot of other media outlets. And whatever you're putting out there, because it can be replicated, it's never really leaving. So these decisions and this information and these pictures and videos that we're sharing of ourselves are going to stick with us in the future. And a lot of parents will see this happen to young kids and not realize what all is happening and the long-term consequences that we're having to face. And so another feature of this is our privacy being indefinite. So like I mentioned earlier with the cyberbullying and the trolling and the catfishing, you can have your identity stolen very easily. So as we're forming these relationships with self-disclosure, like I mentioned earlier, and they're becoming more intimate and the information is becoming more personal and private, we're at a large risk and we're put in a very vulnerable position that's kind of hard to avoid. And a lot of kids, especially right now, aren't realizing this vulnerability. And so the things that they're sharing are being taken advantage of endlessly in ways that we can't really foresee. And then lastly, this is the most interesting part of my research in my opinion, but our identities are becoming adaptations. And so to speak shortly on this, because it does get very philosophical and psychological, we're beginning to portray ourselves online and build our identities and our profiles on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And we're able to see what people see very simply because it is just a picture. So when you go on your profile on Instagram, if you're thinking, okay, if I'm a stranger and I'm looking at this person, like I know a lot of people are doing this with roommate searches in college. So if you can put yourself in the shoes of a stranger seeing you, and you can kind of fabricate exactly what you want them to see. You can fabricate what their first impression is going to be with you. So you can post pictures of you with friends, or you with animals, or you really happy and all of this stuff because that's who you want to be and that's who you want to be seen as. But in this photo, you see a girl who's very sad, painting a picture of herself metaphorically on Instagram, very happy. And this leads to people also kind of tricking themselves, so to speak, into thinking there's someone that they're not yet. So in this instance, we're going to assume this girl has depression. So she's battling with a mental disorder, but she's posting online pictures of herself very happy. And in psychology, this is seen as self-actualization, where we have our present selves and our future selves, who we want to be. And there's a natural tension between these two because we're always struggling to get there. But online, if you're posting pictures of yourself and you're very active as this happy person in this virtual community and virtual world, you can actually begin to convince yourself that you're in that place, and that inhibits self-growth and self-actualization, or just getting to where you want to be in real life. And so it gets very scary at this time. We start to see all of these threats, all of this vulnerability, all of these illusions that we can't seemingly escape. And so when I hit this part in my process, I kind of had to return to the mindset that got me wanting to research this for so long. And I began to think of instances when I saw social media work to its best abilities. I saw the caliber of what we could do when we use social media in a good way and got on these virtual communities and utilized them to their full potential. And so a prime example of this is the hashtag Ice Bucket Challenge. So if you could quickly raise your hand and tell me if you've heard of this before, which I assume would be everyone. It was very popular about a year or so ago, and it was just a hashtag shared on a lot of social media platforms, and people would be dumping buckets of ice water on their heads, and they'd be using this hashtag, and sometimes unknowingly donating money to the ALS Foundation. So the popularity and awareness of it began to benefit this real-world foundation, and it sponsored research. It had $150 million raised to go towards research, and actually ended up being somewhat of a success story because this research led to finding the gene that is the marker for this disease that's very fatal and very unresearched and unknown about. And so we kind of saw a virtual trend turning into a long-term effect in the real world. And so it makes a difference. Everything we're doing on these communities, these people that we are and we are acting through, and these identities that we're building, they're very strong members in a global community, which has never been possible before technology. And so I ask that you take advantage of all these new abilities we're being given, that you're able to discover new things, discover information. Your teachers tell you that all the time. You don't have to go to the library to figure out stuff. You can Google anything, and you can be opened up to worlds of knowledge and culture, and you can experience different worlds and different people from all over the world. And that's really incredible if you think about this. This has never been able to happen before, and we are the generation that's getting to take advantage of this and utilize this and be friends with people across the globe. And we're getting to connect with the whole world around us. So tying back to that term I said in the beginning, the global communities, this is a really massive thing that's happening, and the effects that we can make from it, like the ALS challenge, can be very milestone, they can be very evolutionary, and the issue that we're facing is a lot of people are not being users, but instead abusers. So Generation Z, to leave you from this presentation, I ask that when we enter the workforce and we become adults and we're in the real world, if we can be users and we can take advantage of this technology and all of these capabilities and opportunities we are being handed, we can overall go for the betterment of society and the world altogether. Thank you.